Well, welcome, everybody. A pleasure to have you here with me. I'm Rita McGrath, and my fireside guest this week is Gina O'Connor, who is currently at Babson College after a very long and illustrious run at Rensselaer. And she is also a founding advisor at the R Innovation Group, which hopefully I'll get to talk to you about because I haven't heard too much from you about that. Gina and I go way back in the world of innovation and growth and how corporations can build a ready innovation capability. So a couple of things just to set the stage for the conversation. The first thing I would observe is that people often think about innovation as this like weird, woolly thing, and it can't be predicted. And I think you one of your books calls it grabbing lightning, right? And people don't understand there's actually a practice and a process. And when you get to actually understand it, it's almost like dull, right? I mean, it's like, this is what you have to do first, and then you do this. And so there's actually a practice to it. So that's the first thing I think is people don't know. And the second thing that stems from the first, I think, is it's very possible to become an incredibly senior leader and never have touched upon innovation in any way, shape, or form in your life. And so it's leaving a lot of people at the top of companies where innovation is now right at the top of the agenda, kind of without, a strong sense of what to do. So hopefully today's conversation will demystify some of that and help you figure out a starting point for where you go with innovation next. So Gina, welcome.
Thanks very much, Rita. I'm so glad to be here.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. It's been way too long since we last caught up, for sure.
I usually follow you on the stage.
We do appear at a lot of conferences together. Absolutely.
We do. So yeah. This is really nice to have this opportunity.
Oh, it's terrific. It's terrific. Yeah. So I guess I'd like to start with you and I over the years. I remember one rather hilarious conference where we talked about like the dumbest entrepreneurial ideas that ever got brought to us. And there was one about crocodile farming, as I recall. But anyway, innovation has a lot of myths that have become attached to it for a variety of reasons. And I thought maybe just to start by what are some of your favorites?
Well, I saw that you would kind of seeded that thought. So I was trying to list some of them. And I think, the first one was one that you listed out in kind of the blurb about this, which is that it's all about the ideas. It's so interesting when you talk to companies and everyone's working pretty much on the same problems. There are massive global problems that really are the playground for people who are in the mode of strategic innovations that are going to change the game. And so every company has to figure out kind of how to put a stake in the ground around those problem areas and kind of imagine how they'll be engaging that problem area in the future. And so it's not just about the ideas, and in fact, when we started our first phase of our research, we really thought that that's what the problem was, that getting breakthrough ideas was the problem. It's definitely not. There's just a font of ideas. And we could sit here today and talk about a number of opportunities that we see on the doorstep right now. And technological change is happening so fast, it is enabling a lot of new opportunities that we'd never before been able to consider. So, it's not all about the ideas. And companies who are starved for ideas just have to open the spigot. I mean, there are cultural changes and ways that we provide people the freedom to begin to imagine that we're not used to doing in our companies. And so once that starts to happen, there's outside in ideas, there's inside out ideas, and we all know what the big problems in the globe are. So that's number one.
I love that. So one of the things I cite you on all the time is you've really broken innovation down into three fundamental building block practices that all have to work together. And that's where often the real problems lie. So, ideation, of course, and then incubation followed by acceleration or commercialization. Maybe elaborate a little bit about what you've learned. And, I guess for those that don't know your work, it might be interesting to unpack a little bit. I mean, you've been at this now for decades, how the whole radical innovation research program got started, because it's an interesting story in and of itself.
It is. Well, let me do that first. And then I have a couple more myths that I want to put out there too as we talk. But anyway, So, as you mentioned, I started my career at Rensselaer, and Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute is a well-known engineering institute with this tiny little business school. And I loved being able to join out of my doctoral program right there because you're in the middle of where innovation is taking place. Their School of Science, their School of Engineering is just like a playground for me. But our dean at the time wanted to get the Lally School of Management, our tiny little business school, on the map. And he wrote a little proposal and he passed it around mostly to the junior faculty. And it was all about, how can we come together as a faculty, a multidisciplinary faculty, to study this problem. And he articulated this problem. Large established companies have gotten really good at new product development, but we've lost our way in terms of the really step change kind of innovation. And everybody probably on this call has experienced that the better you get in terms of the discipline associated with new product development, the more likely you are to kill off anything that could be a breakthrough because of, Rita, your concept of options. We're not used to taking options. We got to know what the end game is going to be before we'll start at this, in the traditional organizational system. So anyway, he collected up about 10 of us, and we got a great grant from the Sloan Foundation, and we partnered with what was then called the Industrial Research Institute, which you know well.
Of course.
And it's a professional organization of R&D directors and CTOs of large established companies, most industrial companies. And that was great because that's the community of companies that was really experiencing this problem. And so we started by soliciting from them projects that senior technical leaders really thought could be game changers, but they were just beginning or somewhere in the stage of development. And so 12 projects came in from 10 massive companies. Everybody knows their names, IBM and DuPont and Corning, et cetera. We tracked with those project teams for 5 years. And what we were trying to do was understand what a project leader and a project team's experience is in trying to create, develop, and commercialize a breakthrough in a large company. And that was the first phase of the work. After 5 years, we had learned an awful lot. And I would say the primary learning there was about this dimensionality and the complexity of uncertainty. At that point, most of us thought about breakthrough innovation as high market and high technical uncertainty. And we had also seen from the project leader's perspective and the team's perspective, these two additional dimensions, which were resource uncertainty and organizational uncertainty, which, we can talk about further. But it was really the organizational uncertainty that submarined most of these projects, right? And project managers are not prepared to handle it. And they don't believe it's part of their job. So we identified a couple of companies that had interesting approaches to handling these projects. And so it gave an idea for a second phase. And at that point, I took over the leadership of the program and initiated a phase that said, well, is this concept of a radical innovation hub? That's what we were calling it before. Start to treat these as a portfolio, because the way you have to manage these things with all these dimensions of uncertainty, the kinds of support you give to project leaders, and the kinds of governance and criteria used for evaluating projects has to be very different from the mainstream, which we all understand now. So these couple of the companies were really kind of treating this as a portfolio and instituting a culture and kind of a management system around it. So we went back to the IRI and we were like, okay, now we want to talk about building a capability, an organizational capability for breakthrough innovation. So we're doing it over and over again, not just a one-off glamour project kind of a thing. So that was the second phase. And There were 12 companies that volunteered in for that study, and then another 9 that served as a validation set, and that they started calling me up and saying, I've heard about this study, how can I get in? So they would come to RPI every 6 months and we'd test out our working hypotheses with them. We traced with that original set of 12 companies for another 5 years. We met with them every 6 months. The people responsible for building this capability in the organization, those to whom they reported, and then their staff. So we wanted to see how they were structuring and where they were located, and was it all cultural? Was it really going to be a big formal thing? I would say that's what resulted in the Grabbing Lightning book. And I would say of all the 3 phases of the work, that's where we learned the most. I mean, it was a very intense project of the changes that were occurring, the levels of the points in the company where these decisions were getting made. And that's where the discovery and incubation and acceleration capabilities kind of came through, as we saw where they were moving and how much longer they were keeping the projects, and the differences over time and the level of resources that were going into this, the nature of the type of people they were bringing in. It was so dynamic. They were changing so rapidly. And what we were looking at there was how you build a whole management system to do this as a capability. And so discovery, incubation, and acceleration in many companies today is considered a process. They call it the DIA process. But I do, I keep saying they're competencies, and each of them has their own processes, their own metrics, their own kind of skill sets. You would never resource acceleration the same way you resource discovery. It's all, so we've got to tune the management system elements to each of those pieces of it.
So I want to just break in for one sec, because a couple of things that probably aren't like earth-shatteringly remarkable to you, but are to the world at large. The first is to stick with a research program for that length of time is not a luxury very many of us have in the world. I mean, in the world of scholarly journals, which are based on huge data sets with lots of number crunching and statistics, if you get 9 months to stick with the data set, you're lucky. And secondly, though, I think what's even more important is what you were studying, which was the insides of companies, the actual day-to-day management decisions, the practices. And at the time, those of us, and I was largely in strategy, I had an interest in innovation, but I was largely sort of boxed in the strategy world. That was considered, déclassé. That was second class. The best you could say about it was, it was action research, because the cool people were all doing like industry studies with lots of work on the PIMS database. And I think one of the ways that we have actually badly served many of our most important constituents is not paying enough attention to the kind of work you were doing, because it was very rich and very full of learning and really important. And yet, in our scholarly journals, it really struggled to get its due.
As have I, in terms of the publications. So that's all fine. And, we can go down that path to talk. I was denied tenure the first time.
I didn't know that.
Yep, I was. And the nice thing is that I was on a mommy track.
Uh-huh.
So I'd had an extended tenure clock, and I tried to go up before, the final piece of it. But for the exact reasons that you mentioned, the first time it didn't work.
Yeah.
But
I didn't know that.
It was a mommy track that allowed me to do the kind of work that I did.
But I think what we're learning now is that's so important. I mean, I'm now finding my academic colleagues coming, to people like me and saying, how do I create work that's more relevant? How do we have more impact? How do we do more of this kind of thing? So, he who laughs last, Gina, is the way I would think about it.
Oh, you can't believe. Well, there's a lot of stories on that, but yeah, and actually, and we don't want to spend too much time on this topic, but the Accreditation Bureau for Business Schools, AACSB, is also changing their expectations around research in terms of how we measure impact. No longer is it just about how many FT50s did you get. It really isn't. And so things like being invited to give talks to industry and these sorts of things are now part of what they're looking for business schools who are seeking accreditation. And I think that that is way overdue, obviously, but extremely important and really promising for the relevance of business schools. There are plenty of articles out there that say, why do we have the dive in MBA enrollments, And so it's really got to be through engagement with practice on a regular basis with the lens of a social science researcher. Many of us, the way you think, the way I think, we are social science researchers. And a lot of what's happened in research is people who are statisticians and engineers come in with major data sets. It serves a purpose, but only one of many purposes we have to serve from a research perspective. So.
Absolutely. We should probably have a whole nother fireside chat on business schools and research in business.
Oh, I would love to. There are a couple of business schools that have contacted me because they've read Grabbing Lightning. And there's a greenfield one starting in Canada that's trying to use our principles.
How wonderful.
I know.
Well, anyway, I didn't want to get you off track. So you were talking about the first chunk of time was really coming up with these game changers. Second was looking at how they navigated these 4 kinds of uncertainty.
Yeah, well, so the first one was at the project level.
Mm-hmm.
The second one was, as a corporation, if you want to try to build this as a capability that has staying power now, how do you do that? And for the academics who are on the call or people in practice, we talk about ambidexterity. You've got to build the new streams and the mainstream at the same time, or explore and exploit, or however you want to call it. And so what we were trying to look at is what were the models for that happening. And my contention, and yours also, Rita, I'm sure, is it's less about the balance and more about the fact that we just don't know how to create the new streams. We have to learn how to create the new streams. And then I'm sure, confident that in the next generation, companies will be doing both with equal capability, but we just haven't learned how to do this yet.
Well, and I have a hypothesis that part of the reason we haven't is that we've been operating in this reality that for many companies, competitive advantages lasted a long time. So take DuPont, right? I mean, DuPont invented nylon and lived on nylon for 40 years.
Yeah.
I mean, you didn't need a radical innovation that often, but now we're in a world where entry barriers have come down, competitive advantages are shorter. Just about anything you do can be imitated. And so you've got to have really fundamental things that are just really hard to copy unless somebody's been working on it for a long time, or somebody's just going to go, well, that looks great, I'll just take that, right? So I think there's a real structural shift in the economy, which is causing people to now realize I can't just repeat yesterday the way that I used to.
And also, I wrote this little thing that went out on LinkedIn called No Fear, No Shame. And it was a really interesting thought piece because at least in the US now, not so much in Europe, but our companies have gotten old. We've had enough history, Procter and Gamble, these companies are now over 100 years old, 150 years old. And you look at kind of generations of leadership and how innovation happened as companies start and then grow. And we are just to the point now in a lot of our companies where we've gotten to the point of so many generations removed from the founder that it's not a failure of leadership. It's the fact that we have to now add a capability. It's kind of a consequence of aging and of maturation, that we have to have this kind of become a professional capability, much like marketing did, or now supply chain management. Look how professionalized that the purchasing department now is all about supply chain management. Innovation is going to become the next business discipline in terms of a function in a company. That's kind of my take on this. Our problem has been over history is that we start and we stop. We start and we stop.
Oh, yeah.
And the stops have been so brutally abrupt, like the whole portfolio is disbanded. The people who many of them leave the company. And so you don't even have organizational memory, much less organizational expertise around this any longer.
Yeah. Well, I talk about it in terms of episodic innovation, right? So some big spark says, damn it, we need more innovation around here. You, go form a skunk works, go off and wear painter pants at midnight if that's what helps. And then, this goes on for 2 or 3 years and they begin to kind of make some breakthroughs and they start to get some learning. And then someone, either the boss changes, the champion changes, or there's some setback in some other part of the business and they all go out looking for something to kill to make the next quarter. And you end up with, as you said, this sort of dispersal in diaspora. Only, a year and a half, 2 years, 3 years later, some other person says, damn it, we need more innovation around here. And it's just deadly, I mean, I'm almost to the point where I'm like, if you're not prepared to stick with it, just why? Like, why put us all through this misery?
Exactly. There are a lot of excuses made. And I think the thing I'm struggling with right now in the companies that I'm working with is really some kind of an underlying anxiety that this is going to be too hard, that it's too big to bite off. So, where do we start so that we can get to an end game equilibrium state? And they'll start down the path, but then they get too nervous. And I'm more, I want to know why, and I want to know how people like you and like me and others can help companies realize that all we're doing is we're beginning to build their next capability. And there's not a silver bullet. It doesn't happen in 6 months. It takes a while to build this capability. But I think that the world of research and the kind of research where you and I would get our hands dirty in there is really helping. We know so much more now than we did even 5 or 10 years ago, so I think we can help.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I always tell people is the best way to match disruptive challenges is not with a disruptive response. Like, you do not need to turn your company inside out and upside down to deal with this. You need to start somewhere.
Right.
You need to learn, then you need to build on it. And some of my favorite examples of companies that have, in the end, reached a very disruptive place did it very gradually. It wasn't like the cavalry marching in on horses. I mean, it was, let's digitize the faxes that we get on our orders. Or it's, I know, this was an innovation I absolutely adore. And I'm convinced it came from some intern, but I went to the motor vehicle department here in New Jersey. And, we all approach going to the motor vehicle department with a sense of joy and lightheartedness because it's going to be a wonderful experience. And so they sent me to one desk and they checked my documents and made sure I had everything I needed to get what I was going to do. And that all checked out. And then they said, oh, do you have a cell phone on you? I said, yes. So I gave them my number. And they said, fine, we'll text you when we're ready for you. And I'm looking around the DMV and normally it's full of, disgruntled people and parents with nervous kids. And there was nobody in the place. And I thought to myself, I bet some intern said, well, why do you make people sit there while they're waiting? They could be doing something else. Furthermore, it's a better experience for the employees because they're not being grumped at. Furthermore, it's a better, and you just think about something that simple, and you could just start with something as simple as that. And my God, the Department of Motor Vehicles can do it. Any company on the planet should be able to do
You're talking government agency here, right?
Right. So I think part of my answer anyway, and I'd love to hear more of yours, is you can start small. But I do think, and I know you speak about this as well, getting this portfolio management right, to me, I keep coming back to it. It's just, no matter where else I try to start, it always ends there, because managing the portfolio and managing the governance process for innovation, to me, just go hand in hand. And if you don't have that, unless you've got a senior leader like absolutely brute forcing this thing through, which is not a capability, right? That's a property of an individual. That's not an organizational capability. Unless you've got that, you haven't got a prayer. It'll just get killed in the internal politics.
Well, and also, so we talk about domains of innovation intent, which I think aligns with a lot of what you talk about with regard to seeing around corners thing. So you asked how do I think about what the outcomes of book 2 were since then. And so there's discovery, incubation, and acceleration as capabilities. But what I've realized since then, since moving to Babson and really working a little bit more with companies, I'm working with companies through our innovation group.
I want to talk more about that, because I was checking you out and I didn't know you had a whole business doing this. This is great.
So, but the fourth capability, and it's really in the hands of senior leadership, is the capability of defining the domains of innovation intent, and articulating them in ways that are compelling and energizing. And I say it's a capability because it's not something that we're used to. It's sort of, as we started this conversation, how do you start to get people who have risen through the ranks by being great at operational excellence and customer intimacy and, delivery, to start to imagine futures. And so it is through the strategic innovation function or group that though they're helped, those people who are engaging in open innovation and spotting out the weak signals need to start bringing some of that information forward. And it's through these kinds of workshops or facilitated discussions, which I think is the real role of what a chief innovation officer's responsibility is. How do we help an innovation council, very senior leaders in the organization, start to think about the 10-year out, or whatever the proper horizon is for your industry, and once you can kind of articulate what those futures are in terms of where we want to put a stake in the ground, what those big problem spaces are, now that unleashes creativity within a set of guardrails, and that becomes its own portfolio, so that it's not like each project is a go kill decision. Within a domain, there's an opportunity landscape. We're trying to find it. And that's what discovery is all about. What are the borders of that landscape? How do you populate that landscape? And every one of those becomes an experiment, right? And over time, in the incubation phase of this, that's when you start to come to some strategic clarity about how this could become an emerging business. And I know you and I say the same thing in different words, but that's where you start to make those tests, validate the propositions. But the other kinds of tests beyond like what discovery-driven planning does is the test for the organizational stomach for these kinds of business models that the market is telling us they would really value. And so within a domain that can become an emerging business, there are so many degrees of freedom of what the first field of use is, what the first application is, what the right business model could be, and how we as a company want to engage and who we bring partners in on, all that sort of thing. So this concept of portfolio, it's not only within a domain, but then you've got, let's say, 5 domains. Because everything that you're looking at from a strategic innovation for our future point of view is risky. So the whole idea of a portfolio is how do you hedge your bets? And the best way you can do it is kind of diversify across those domains. And so I just think that could help reduce the fear factor that so many individuals feel, which, by the way, was the third phase of our research about individuals.
So talk about that.
So of all those elements of the management system that we identified, that we were questioning about in the second phase of how you build the capability, the one that was our question always is, why don't companies stick with this? What's the hang up? What's the barrier? And what we found in that was the main issue for not sticking with it was talent management. And it's so interesting, the R&D community, you've got scientists, they're always testing hypotheses, and their career doesn't depend on whether the test proved them right or not, right? It depends on how well they did the test, how quickly, how creatively, what they learned. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, you're going to get something out of these many tests. It's not that way for new business creation personnel that are the right-hand partners with these R&D people. That's not their reality.
Well, and you have an article that talks about that, which is, that R&D spend is not enough, I think was the title of it.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And so you need people who are, they're not typical marketing people. They're not external startup entrepreneurs. There is this kind of special group of people that I like to call new business creation people. They love being part of the corporate world. They love the fact that they're part of this huge, well-known brand name, that they can reach out internally. The internal informal networks are the single highest correlate to innovation performance that we found in surveys that we've done. And so the people who do discovery have certain characteristics. The people who do incubation have certain characteristics. And the people who do acceleration have certain characteristics. So that was what we didn't know that, but we set out to understand in the third phase, what's this whole talent management career risk situation about? And so we started off interviewing people in R&D who were well known as inventors, you know, the hero scientists as they are called. And we said, who have you depended on in your company? Who have you called when you have something you think is cool? And then we interviewed those people. And then we interviewed the, you know, so it was the snowball sample. And we just learned an awful lot. But what we were able to do is start to map what the work that they did onto our discovery, incubation, acceleration at the opportunity level, the domain level, and the leadership level. And so that third book, which we call Beyond the Champion, Institutionalizing Innovation Through People, it's kind of like a set of job descriptions and selection characteristics, and then a lot of thinking and some cues that we had seen around career pathing for people who want to stay in the world of innovation. There's a cool diagram in the book that shows people's real career paths. What they're promised is, if you start this cool idea, you can become the general manager of that business, and that's how you're going to get promoted up through the ranks of influence. And then they said, but here's what really happens. I start something that's fun. I get my hand slapped for one reason or another. I have to go into the world of operational excellence for a while and prove myself. And then I get to go try something again. And it just scrolls back.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, plus, the other thing I would observe is that a lot of the people that thrive on this, you know, nurturing something new and bringing it into the world, they don't want to run a big complex machine. That's just not their thing, right? And so I think it was our mutual friend Ron Pirantosi who said, you know, innovation, it involves great jobs but lousy careers.
That's exactly right. I mean, my colleague Andrew Corbett has an article written by that. But let me see if you resonate with this. One thing we noticed is, if you take a person who really is an innovation person in any of them, discovery or incubation or acceleration, and you put them in an operational excellence job, they get depressed, like depressed. And which results in anger and cynicism. You know, everybody knows cynical people at work, right? If you take a person in the world of operational excellence who, you know, is very good at it, quite comfortable in that role, and you put them in the world of innovation, anxiety, they're very anxious.
That's the word that came to my mind exactly.
Yeah. And not one of those people, but an innovation person that we interviewed said, my job is to chart a course through the fog. I love that line. And he loves doing that. But so many of us would just go apoplectic if we had to do that, you know.
Well, and I'll bring that back to where we are right now, because for the first time, you know, all of us all over the world are experiencing high levels of uncertainty. And a lot of people I know who are these, you know, very operational people, they've always known what to do. There's a handbook, there's a guide, there's, you know, certifications. And now they're in this world of, you've actually got to chart a path through this fog. And it's incredibly anxiety provoking. I mean, they're just, behind closed doors, you know, when nobody else is listening. I feel like I'm a therapist sometimes. They're just sort of, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to lead this. I was with a senior leadership team, you know, quite close to the board level. And they're being asked to think about how they're going to handle a big transition in their business. And I'm getting, we don't know how to do this. We don't know how to plan for it. And I'm raising like absolute basics. Like, let's talk about how you might budget for innovation. What would a person have to do to get some budget for innovation in your company? Oh, well, we have our NPI form, our new product introduction form, and it's 50 pages long. And there's this, ROI calculation you have to provide. And there's this present value calculation to it. And I'm like, oh, okay. What would I have to do to get $1,000 to test a hypothesis from you people? And they don't have they don't know. And so it's interesting because they've got 3 areas they really want to pursue. And their CEO's idea of how he's going to get this done is he's going to put a VP in each of these areas and let that person, just sort of figure it out. And I'm like,
I bet I can guess
it's your company, you do what you want. But if you want advice from me, don't do that. Like, it's not going to work for you. It's not going to work for them. And so I usually at this point drag out the examples from my flops file. That you may have heard of, which is I collect these case studies of flops, which are innovations that just went grievously wrong, like WebVan, 1.5 billion to figure out, that we don't hate grocery shopping as much as we said we did, or what's the most recent one is Quibi, right? And all of these things, just this common pattern of characteristics. So untested assumptions, assuming they were facts, too much money all up front, huge teams right from the outset, and so your work, my work would suggest this is just nuts, and yet it keeps happening. So
that was actually on my list of myths too.
Yeah.
That's the thing, Rita. I just the time is right. The time has come for companies to learn how to do. We know more about how to do it. We can help advise companies, and I think, as people coming through school programs now, or exec ed programs or whatever, are increasing in their level of influence in companies who have had exposure to innovation, it's going to take a generation to change, I'm afraid. You do see companies where there's kind of 2 in the box at the leadership level, which, who was it? Sam Palmisano and Bruce Harreld at IBM during that time. Palmisano knew in his head, but he knew he didn't know in his gut. So he had Bruce Harreld on a text. I had Bruce Harreld come and speak to our MBAs at RPI, and he was telling the story about how they had to operate as 2 in the box because Sam knew he couldn't trust himself in an innovation decision situation. And during the time, Bruce
started under Gerstner, because I was involved in that. I think you and I were both on different committees as part of that whole, I'm thinking around year 2000 project that Gerstner set up the EBO program.
Yes, that's right. And so, but when Palmisano then took over, the story is, while Bruce Harreld is talking to my students, he gets a text or a call from Palmisano. He had to step out of the room and take the call, and he comes back. He said, "See, I told you. He doesn't trust himself, but he trusted Bruce Harreld, who really had the instinct." And the same we saw at DSM, with Rob Van Leen, who you know as well, and Fike. I can't say his last name, but the CEO and Chief Innovation Officer combination there. So the point is that, as you said, there are a number of people in leadership roles who don't know what they don't know, and they don't want to. But then there are others who know that they don't know and they want to. And that's kind of where the hope is. I think that.
Yeah, blessedly, I'm working with a lot of those right now.
Yeah.
We don't know how to start this. Maybe you do. So maybe a couple more myths, and then you have a set of 8 principles, right, that you've talked about in various talks over the years about, succeeding at strategic innovation, which perhaps would be helpful to our listeners to kind of go through. So maybe a couple of myths, and then we'll go to that.
Okay, let me just read off my other myths here. Second myth: the market wasn't ready yet for my breakthrough. There is so much work to be done to create a market. It's as time consuming and as expensive as creating a breakthrough technology. And we don't have the skill sets and the mechanisms for the investments to make it happen. But this is why I love the large company environment, because of the brand power, the foresight, the networks that we do have in those kinds of environments. But to say the market wasn't ready yet,
Mhm.
to me, is just a huge waste of technical resources.
Well,
You know,
and what I often find is people will go right to the technology. So my poster child at the moment for this is autonomous vehicles, right? So we got to figure out autonomy. That's great. So we'll strap a bunch of sensors to a Volvo and drive it around, Pittsburgh or whatever. And the technology is pretty good. I mean, it really is pretty good in closed, environments. It actually does a great job. I've got a client right now that actually has a robot operated mind. So the human beings tell the robots what to do, and the robots are perfectly capable of executing it. It's a closed environment. The tech isn't the problem. It's what's the ownership regime? What's the risk regime? Who's going to be responsible for these things? If it's a choice between the grandmother and the baby in a push cart, who gets chosen? It's not the tech.
Right. Yeah, and actually, I know regarding the pandemic. So we're flipping all around here, but these issues that you're bringing up right now. This was actually occurring before the pandemic, which is the technology is marching so fast and we're so enamored of it that we forget about, what we're calling now the market. But really what we're forgetting about is the human element in terms of basic human psychology and sociology in terms of how we want to interact as groups. And the pandemic, with the isolation that it is required of us, I think it's a great time to re-examine these basic human needs. Mm-hmm. And we've allowed technology to divorce us from that. And it's like you're a fool if you can't keep up with technology, as opposed to the other way around. Technology should be in service of the human needs. And talk about a discontinuity right now at this time is giving us that opportunity space. And I've said this in talks and I've said this to companies, but again, they can't steep in it yet, so thinking about how we think about opportunity landscapes in the future with regard to very basic human needs. I think we're seeing around corners. The signal to noise on this one is becoming a little bit clearer. So that was one. The market wasn't ready. Here's another one. Everyone should be involved in innovation in the company. So just like, let's draw a parallel to this topic of be customer oriented. Everyone in the company should be customer oriented, but everyone should not be in the marketing department, right?
Right.
So everyone in the company needs to be innovation oriented. There's going to be process improvements. There's going to be ideas that you've got in your job, and we have to have a culture that really encourages people to speak those out. But not everyone should be creating the future of the company through the strategic innovation, high uncertainty regimes. Somebody's got to be driving operational excellence and meeting today's needs. So this idea of an us versus them mentality and the glamour project, that's why I think, we've talked about different kinds of payment schemes and incentives and all this kind of stuff. No, the strategic innovation function is just another element of keeping our company healthy. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, that was another one.
Safi Bahcall, who wrote this great book called Loom Shots. I don't know if you know Safi, but he has this wonderful phrase I just love. He says, you have your soldiers and you have your artists, and you have to love both equally.
Yes. Yeah, that's good. Strategic innovation is too expensive, too risky, and too time consuming. I mean, geez, what could be more risky and time consuming and expensive than not doing it?
That's what I'm always stunned by, which is, you guys are perfectly happy to plow, $50 million into a line extension of a thing, right? And yet to put $500,000 into figuring out like what the next generation of users is going to really be wanting. No, that's too expensive. It's always blown my mind. And I do think, and this is something I worked on a lot with Clayton Christensen when he was still around, was the metrics that just drive people backwards.
Right.
They're not looking at leading indicators, they're looking at lagging indicators, and it's causing huge problems.
Yep. The last one I'll say, I mean, there are more, but the last one, technology push is a bad thing. Mm-hmm. I love technology push, and I have a PhD in marketing. But, we've got to be agnostic to where the possibilities come from. They're all just possibilities. But if it comes from R&D or open innovation, a university lab, the first place you go is start to consider the fields of use in the market. If it comes from a market request, the first thing you do is, well, what are the solutions? So who cares where it starts?
Right. Well, Safi makes an interesting observation about the origins of a lot of technologies that are talked about in retrospect as disruptive in the Christensen sense of it. And he says, actually, they weren't. They were entirely incremental technologies when they started, and that's how they were looked at. And then we found out, oh my God, there's this other stuff that they can do. The other thing that I think is super interesting goes back to some of Mike Tushman's work on architectures and how architectures change, and Rebecca Henderson as well. Mm-hmm. And when it's market driven, in other words, when a market is able to articulate a clear demand for something, that is highly likely to be similar to what came before, as opposed to it being technology led, which, just as you're saying, is it's opening up a vector of possibility, which nobody knew existed before. So sometimes technology first things do that, right? Who knew we needed supercomputers in our pockets till we figured out that we could actually use them, Yeah.
I was just on with a company yesterday that was, I just can't believe what I hear is happening in our labs. They've got a way of using neuroelectronic gizmos to treat disease that could replace a huge swath of pharmaceuticals.
I've heard that. Yeah, I've heard that. That's fascinating. Yes. It's fascinating. And I was actually doing an insight foresight workshop thing with a big pharma company. And this is fascinating to me. So they'd flagged up telemedicine as an issue, right? That there's going to be these telemedicine and these alternatives to pharma and everything. And yet when it came time to actually create a small experimental group to figure telemedicine out, they were like, well, no, we think we're just going to, that's not really critical for this quarter. And I'm like, folks, if we have learned nothing else during the pandemic than this, it is that no one gets great joy out of sitting in a doctor's office waiting. The doctor's not happy with it. The patient's not happy with it. And what's happening with medicine, of course, is it's all coming closer to the home, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. But there's such reluctance to say, okay, maybe it's an issue, right? Fascinating. So succeeding at strategic innovation, you've got at least
boy, I don't know if I have them memorized, Rita.
Oh, well, you don't need to. You don't need to. I'll run through them quickly because I was so taken with them. I printed them out, and then maybe some elaboration on each of them. So, common language for innovation, a key leadership responsibility, a function, not a process, not a culture, but a designed management system. The organization's capability to absorb new businesses, 3 competences, not just one. Opportunity, domain, and portfolio level, 4 dimensions of uncertainty: technical, market, resource, and organizational, and institute permanent innovation roles. And I thought, that is so refreshing to have such a clear kind of, you're not going to do it that way, you're going to do it this way. And I just thought that was just such a nice summary of so much of what you've learned over all these decades.
Well, you start to work with companies and they all want sort of the answer. And I had to sit back for a while and say, what have I learned over these 25 years? And it was just incredible how it flowed. Yeah. And so that is a great way to start, for a company to start to assess, where do we really need to do the work? How so there's a little bit of background and workshoppy stuff behind all that. And then they kind of assess, and then they talk about what they think, where do we think we stand on each of these things? And you just even start with the first one, the language. And we all talk about language, and everybody's tired of the horizons of growth model and all the ways that we sort out innovation. But it is so important because, for example, there are a number of companies that have told me, we've adopted all of your materials and we use them all the time. So our entire company uses the DIA model. I'm like, why? The whole company is not supposed to use the DIA model. That's for the high uncertainty regime. It's kind of like, one answer for everything. And, we need to really be able to distinguish. And it's all around so much of the work that you've done, around uncertainty, and so many of us have done. Because, in order to keep the revenue generating and the margins high, we've got to have a world of what we know and what we know, and that has to be working very well. If that world of lower uncertainty isn't percolating, we don't even have a company.
Well, right. And I always say, that core business, that Horizon One, whatever you want to call it, that's got to be healthy. It's not like that's not important. Of course, it's important, but without the balance between the two, you end up with your Kodak moment, right? And I think that's the almost heartbreaking part. So, tell me a little bit about the R Innovation Group.
Well, right when our first book was published, I mentioned to you that there were two companies in that study where we were seeing the cues to people who were trying to manage these as companies that were trying to manage this as a portfolio. And one of those was a woman who was the vice president of the New Ventures division at Nortel Networks. Well, right before the book was published, as would happen, they've been at it for 4 years. Regime changed. The new CEO wanted to grow by mergers and acquisition, and that group was expunged. And she did not want to go back into the mainstream. And the book was coming out, and we were already starting to get some consulting inquiries. And here we are, a group of 6 professors, and consulting was okay, but we didn't want to be running a whole thing. So we formed together with her the R Innovation Group. And, over time, different professors left for various reasons, but I stuck with it until I joined Babson. So we worked together for almost 20 years. And that was where we got to test out that a lot of what we were learning, not only around the 4 uncertainties and the learning plan that we had developed and all those kinds of things, and the transition issues associated with moving something from the innovation thing into the mainstream. We developed a bunch of tools and processes and workshops around those things. So we got to test whether those principles worked and how they had to vary in different kinds of companies, right? And I loved that. So I was like the CTO, if you will, and she sort of turned things into tools and made it happen. And I'd go engage for parts of it. And then when the phase 2 was done around how you actually build out a management system for breakthrough innovation and this capability, that really took off. And we ended up working with the US Air Force and a number of companies in Europe and a number of things. But and then I joined Babson right when the 3rd book was coming out. And the purpose there was to kind of bring a lot of this in and treat it in a customized executive education advising kind of a scenario. And so I had to split from our innovation group.
Oh, I see. Okay. So that's not what you're doing anymore.
But she's still working and it's going.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about what Babson's up to these days, because I at one point was very involved with the annual research conference, and a lot of my good buddies were there. Mark Rice was there, a bunch of others, and so you're bringing this into executive education now there.
Yeah. So Mark Rice recruited me to come. He was provost for a while.
He's very, very persuasive.
Yes, he is. And then
Mark has this talent.
Yes. And my co-author on the book, Andrew Corbett, was the division chair for the entrepreneurship division. Mm-hmm. And so we were getting inquiries through the book again, and Babson has this phenomenal executive education operation. RPI had nothing of that sort. And so I was trying to negotiate something with them about, as we turn this in and to respond to these inquiries from these companies, what would be my role there. And so Andrew, who also lives here in New York, even though he's at Babson, we still both live in New York. And
oh, wow.
So we would meet at Panera's, in Clifton Park here, halfway between. And I come with all my little terms, and he goes, okay, well, we just want you to come and join us. Mm. And I think I took about 5 minutes to think about it, because the whole idea is, how do you take all of this and turn it into these kind of bite-sized chunks and customization, the customized approach that Babson has to executive educate, to working with companies, and they have just they're learning together with me, and they're now calling this the corporate innovation practice area. I'm the faculty lead, and there's a staff behind it, and we're it's Rita, it's like a dream come true for an academic like you or like me. And I know you have a really thriving set of activities that you do through Columbia, but also on your own. And I just don't like to do it on my own. I just can't stand all the contracting and all that stuff. So it's really nice with Beth.
Well, the key thing there is you hire someone who really loves doing that stuff. That makes a big difference.
I haven't found anybody like that. But I'm kind of like a corporate innovator. I don't like to be on my own. I really like to be something that's bigger. I'm trying to build an institute now at Babson. We're so well known for entrepreneurship, and I'm like, how do we put a stake in the ground around corporate entrepreneurship and corporate innovation?
I think that's great. I think that's great, because I mean, I do think Babson has just outpunched its weight in the entrepreneurship startup space for decades now. And so many of my friends are there. It's just such a
Why don't you come and join us, Rita?
Well, never say never, right? But I think it's a very ripe space. I think companies, it's what's the old line, like companies will get to innovation once they've tried everything else, and then they'll finally figure it out. It's great.
Nice to be at a place where people know to come.
Yeah.
And if we can build a center of excellence and the reputation around corporate innovation, that's why I'm here, because I it's just at this point in our careers, we want companies to benefit from everything that we've learned. Absolutely. And so that's the deal.
One of our listeners says, coincidentally, I just finished creating an entrepreneurial education ecosystem with Mark Rice and Candy Brush.
Okay.
Names that go way back. So how do people learn more?
Well, Babson does, I have a faculty webpage. People can get in touch with me directly. And then the executive education division has a listing of, there's some open enrollment programs, but mostly it's custom work. And people can get in touch through just looking at executive education there.
Oh, that's great. Well, I just so have enjoyed this. This time is just absolutely flown. And you and I should just be to be continued. And maybe we will do another session on the education part. I think that would be super interesting, because
I'd be really happy
massive inflection points flowing through this whole space in terms of even what research is, and how we think about what good research is, what good social research is. And I just think that's a question we don't ask enough, and I think we're ready now to ask that question. If we're thinking about how do institutions like ours remain relevant in a world that is changing so quickly, and do we really need to understand the rise and fall of the pushcart business in Vienna in 1922? Population ecology lens, like organizations as bugs, and I mean, there are things one can learn, right? But not. Well, thank you so much, and to be continued.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rita.